system didn't work. The cartel policy, the merger policy flopped. And at that point, some of the, each step of the way, some of the more far-sighted in the sense of realizing this was a flop among the business groups decided the only way to preserve a cartel or preserve a merger is to have the government enforce it, to turn of the political arm to create the cartel for you. And this was the origin of progressive regulation. The progressive system was not a group of far-sighted, essentially it was not a group of far-sighted intellectuals who sat around and said we have to plan, we have to curb businessmen for the sake of a public interest. It was a group of groups of businessmen saying we have to impose cartels through the government and thereby eliminating our competition, curbing the maverick firm which doesn't want to engage in a cartel, and gaining profits that way. So, for example, in railroad regulation, the first things they did after the business put in the railroad businesses put in the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, the first thing the ICC did was to outlaw secret price cutting. Because secret price cutting is always the great instrument by which an individual firm can bust the cartel. And how you do it? You do it in the name of publicity. Or you say, well, it's a terrible thing to have a secret price cutting. All prices should be, the books should be open. All firms should release publicity about their prices and costs, et cetera, so the public will know, the right to know, and all that jazz. What it really meant was we want to know what our competitors are charging, and we do it by making the government make all of us release, open the books. So anyway, this is, and of course you do this in the name of openness or democracy or whatever, in the name of the public interest, because America was born in an anti-monopoly ideology, a hatred of monopoly, meaning, by the way, monopoly meant for centuries, until modern economics came in and poisoned the well, so to speak, what monopoly meant was very simple. It meant a grant of special privilege on the part of the government to different businesses for exclusive production or sale of a product, period. It didn't mean a large firm. It didn't mean a differentiated product and all the rest of it. And it meant very simply grant by the government of exclusive privilege. It's very much like during the discussion of Professor Peden before that when the church fathers attacked the rich, they didn't mean the rich, period. They meant tax collectors and so forth. It's a similar situation. A shift in the language. So how could they sell this to the American public? How could these business groups sell this, a compulsory cartel system to the American public? They can't say we want compulsory cartels. So what they did was they created the ideology of the public interest. This is the public good. We have to curb evil business groups and sort of stuff. And the businessmen who took this position were then called enlightened by their allies, by the media, whatever, the media of that epoch. These are enlightened businessmen who rise above their own self-interest to look at the larger good. They have the far vision of, like Diocletian. They want to curb their selfish profits for the good of the entire industry and the good of the country. Now, how was this ideology pushed? The ideology was pushed very simply by intellectuals who are rising up. Throughout history, the statism has been imposed by two groups, an alliance of two groups. The state itself, the state apparatus, the king, the throne, and the opinion-molding groups, the intellectuals, which in most cases in history have been the churches, the state church. And so this is known as the alliance of throne and altar. You have the church and the state. The church, the function of the church was to tell the people to obey the state. The state is God in many cases. The king is God. The king is divinely sanctioned. And in return for this, and the public believes them, because they're the intellectual opinion molders. And in return for that, the church gets part of the boodle. They get part of the state revenue in the form of tax subsidies and so forth. So this is a very cozy alliance until essentially Western Europe, until the age of Western Europe, and when church and state were separated. And essentially, in the progressive period in the early 20th century, you begin to reform the old alliance of intellectuals and government, big government intellectuals, who perform the function of court apologists for the new regime, and informing the public this is the public interest, the common good, the general welfare, and all the rest of it. Now, the intellectuals are ready for this alliance because there are a lot of them coming up. There's a multiplication of the number of intellectuals in the world, in this country, in the late 19th century. The PhD program came in. Suddenly, PhDs poured on the market, engineers poured on the market, various guild groups, physicians, all that. And they're looking for jobs, and also looking for special privilege. They're looking for ways to keep their competitors out. And so this alliance became a very cozy one because the intellectuals then became state intellectuals. They became planners, apologists for planning, and so forth and so on. Okay, so this is the general background of the banking situation. So we have to realize the Federal Reserve System was a progressive measure. In 1913, it was part of the Wilson progressive package, Woodrow Wilson being the acme of progressivism up to that point. And once again, we have a similar situation. There was no, before the Federal Reserve System, there was no free banking. There was a quasi-centralized system. Free banking, or an approximation of free banking, was before the Civil War, approximately from the 1840s, after Andrew Jackson destroyed the central bank of his epoch, until the Civil War. During those 20 years or so, it was more or less free banking system, competitive. There was no centralized system, and it worked pretty well. And to the extent it didn't work is because there was still government interference. But basically a free system. During the Civil War, the Republican Party took the opportunity of a one-party Congress, since the South had seceded, to enact their beloved economic legislation, one of which was high tariffs, another of which was the greenbacks, and it was eliminating the gold standard for many years. And a third was to eliminate the free banking system. The way they did it was by imposing a very prohibitive tax on state banknotes, in other words, private banks, and centralizing them, monopolizing the issue of banknotes or paper money in the hands of a few nationally chartered banks. There were no nationally chartered banks before that. Very few large Wall Street banks. And then tying this so any other bank had to, in order to get paper money, had to go had to have deposits in the national banks and in order to buy paper money, so to speak, because the individual banks couldn't issue it themselves. And tying that to the public debt. In other words, the national banks could pyramid their credit on top of U.S. government bonds. And this was done in order to sell the government bonds during the war, the Civil War. And specifically, to get even more specific than that, Jay Cooke was the main instigator of this. Jay Cooke was, being a friend of Secretary of Treasury Chase and a political ally, managed to get the monopoly of all government bond underwriting during the Civil War. Remember, there was hardly any underwriting at all before that. And so this is a tremendous bonanza to Cooke. And he gets the monopoly of all government bond issue. He was the first one to engage in modern propaganda efforts. He hired pamphleteers to talk about the glories of government bonds and all the rest of it. And in addition to that, he essentially pushed through the national banking system, the system I've been talking about, founding so every national bank has to pyramid credit on top of government bonds which they own, thereby forcing the banks to buy government bonds from him, Jay Cooke, since he had the control of all government bonds. And then he himself set up several of these national banks himself as part of this system. So at any rate, after that, this system continues after the Civil War. And the hard money people had to spend at least 15 years trying to get back to gold, period. They couldn't worry about the banking system. And so their energies were restricted or confined to eliminating greenbacks or getting back to gold. So that this system then continues on. We then have a quasi-centralized system based on Wall Street a few Wall Street national banks. But it still was not central. It was a halfway house to the Federal Reserve System. Okay, in this situation, the banks become unhappy, especially the large Wall Street banks become unhappy because they're beginning to be outcompeted by other regional banking structures. Chicago becomes a central reserve city. Kansas City banks become important, and the whole the banking credit system becomes more and more decentralized as the economy grows, and the Wall Street banks become more and more unhappy about the situation. The control is slipping away from them gradually but very rapidly, and another problem was, and this is a problem inherent in all fractional reserve banking. Fractional reserve banking, in my view, is inherently bankrupt. I mean, it's always ready to go bust. The reason is fairly simple. Most businesses, or all businesses, as far as I know, try to adjust the time structure of their assets to flow